I want to show you how to make a rundown. We're not going to make one from scratch because that would take too long. Instead, I'm going to show you how the rundown panel that comes with this video works. A rundown is a series of presets in a table. As you can see in this panel, on the left, I have the panel we made for the context-sensitive videos. It has the two toggle parameters at the top that control the boxes underneath it, and then I added another toggle parameter at the bottom, just so that we have three different presets that we want to control. On the right, I have my rundown, which is a series of events, and each event has a value for each of the three parameters that should be set whenever the event occurs. You typically set up a rundown ahead of your production, so you know that during my pre-show, I want the video to be on program and I want my lights to be slightly dim. And during the opening, I want the camera 1 to be running and my lights to be fully on, and so on and so forth. And then during your show, you can just click on Start to start the show, and it automatically recalls those three presets. And you just can keep hitting Next whenever the next event occurs, and all of your presets are automatically set up for you. So it makes it a lot easier to run your production. So the buttons on the right here have the following functionality. So if I click Start, it just goes to the first one and recalls that event. If I hit Next, it goes to the next one. Previous goes to the previous one. Recall selected allows me to pick a particular event and just recall that one. I can add some new events to my rundown by giving it a name here, like after show, selecting what I want. So after my show, perhaps I'm showing a presentation and I want the lights to be fully on because people are leaving. And I can say add to rundown, and it adds my after show with the right presets that I already have. I can select the event that I want and move it up to where I want it in my show, or move it down, or I can delete it as well. So those are what these buttons do in my rundown. So let's look at how this panel works. The first thing we need for a rundown is a table of data. I made this table using what we call a structured parameter. Unfortunately, you can't make a structured parameter from the UI. You have to make it in the source code. The easiest way to make one is to take an example panel that already has one and just change it so that it has the fields that we want. Let's take a look at how structured parameters look like in the source code. So I'm going to go into panel builder mode, double click anywhere, and go all the way to the top and go into my params section and click on source. We can see all my parameters here. Structured parameters are actually made up of two separate parameters. The first one is a template that basically defines all of the columns in my table. For every column, I have what's called a subparameter. So in my table, I had a name, and then a program, a preview, and the lights. And the name was a string, and the program, preview, and lights are all integers. These subparameters are exactly like normal parameters, except they have the word subparameter, and they have a sub-OID instead of an OID. Once you've defined your template, which basically defines the columns, you can then start adding data into a second parameter. So we have this second parameter, and it has something special called a template OID, which has the name of the parameter, which is our template. Now we also have to make sure that the constraint type is struct and the type is a struct array. Once you've done that, you can have all your values. And for each row, you create a new value entry. And in each one of those entries, you have a subparam with the sub-OID and its value. And you keep doing this for every single row. And that basically defines your structured parameter, your table. Now, if I wanted to add a new column to this table or change one of the columns, how would I do it? As I said before, those rows are all just normal parameters with the word subparam instead of param. So the easiest way to define one is to go into parameters and create a parameter here. So let's say I wanted to add a row called colors. We'll give it a no ID of color, and we're going to make it a string. You can decide how this data is shown, but we're going to make a string that's a choice constraint between red, blue, and green. And its default value will be red, and we'll use the widget hint of a drop-down list. I'm going to commit my changes. So I now have a new parameter called colors. Let's go into our source code, and we're going to move it. So if I go to the top, go into the params and click on source. At the very bottom of this, I should see the new parameter. And here it is. It's called params color, and it has all the constraints that I defined as well. So I can just cut this with Control X, move it to the top, and put it in as a subparameter. So I'll paste it here, Control V, change the word param to subparam, change the OID to sub-OID, and the end param here to end subparam. And we can align things if we want as well. And then apply changes. Then in each row, I can just take the last value, copy it with Control C, paste it, then change the sub-OID to color and give it one of the possible values. And I'm just going to copy and paste that in each row so that each row has a value for that column. And then apply and close. And you'll see my table now has a new row called colors. And if I click on it, they're all a drop-down list with 3 different choices. So that's how you can add new columns to the table. You can also go in and edit them or change or delete some of the columns. Once you have your table, we need a way of selecting an entire row. In order to do that, we go into Panel Builder mode, we double-click on the table, and we give it a config option, w.selectionParam. And we give it the name of a parameter that's going to contain which row is selected. I called mine selection. So this value selection points to a specific parameter called selection. If I go into my parameters, you can see that I have one called selection. And it's just a number, an int 16, with a default value of 1. In fact, I dropped that parameter here so that we can see it. And whenever I change what row is selected, it's going to change that parameter. We need this information so that whenever we do next, we know at which row we are and at which row we need to go next. We also use it if we do recall selected, move up, move down, or delete. We need to know which row is selected. Next, let's take a look at how these buttons work. So these 4 buttons here basically manipulate the data within the table. If I go into Panel Builder mode and double click on Add to Rundown and go into the task, you can see that I'm creating a new object here. In that object, I have all of the sub-OIDs in my columns, and I'm using the existing values of the parameters as the values for the new object. Once I have that object, I count how many elements are in the recalls structured parameter. And at the end, I set the value at that index, which would be the last item, with that new object. So I'm basically inserting that new object into my structured parameter. The delete is similar. If I go into the task, you can see I get the value of the selection parameter, which tells me which row is selected. I create a new array, and then I loop through the existing elements and recalls one by one, and if it's not the one at the index of the selected row, then I add it to the new array, and then I replace all the values with the new array, which does not include the one we deleted. Move up and move down do similar things. We're just going to look at move up. It's going to do the same thing as delete, but instead of deleting the one that's selected, we're going to move it up or move it down. These 4 buttons affect which element is selected and then does a recall on the selected item. So let's take a look at how those are done. So the start's pretty easy. If we go into the task, you can see it's actually using visual logic to do this. So what we're doing is we're taking the selection parameter, which decides which item is selected, and we're setting it to 0. So we're piping a 0 directly into selection. And once that's done, we're calling this method called recall selected. It's in an API function. You can see it here. Now, what does that function do? We have to find the API where that is. So if we're going to scroll up, and we'll find that there's inside of our meta, there's an API. And inside that API, there's a function called recall selected. So what this method does is it gets the value of the selected row. So we know which row is selected in our table. Now we can use that information to set all of the values we want. In this case, we want to set the program, the preview, and the lights. And we want to set them to the values that are in the table. Now, in order to get a value back from a structured param, what we can use params.getValue, the name of the structured parameter, dot, and then the row that we want. So if we want the first row, it would be dot 0 because it's 0 based. If we wanted the third row, it would be dot 2. And then dot the sub-OID, the column that we want. So if we want the program, we could get that. So this call here, params.getValue, recalls to.program at index 0, tells us what's in the program cell of the third row. Now we use this in the following 3 lines. Instead of having the hard-coded .1, .2, or .3, we just tell it, give us the recalls of the selected row, which is determined up here, dot the sub-OID we want. So we're setting the program to what's in our table, we're setting the preview to what's in our table, and we're setting the lights to the row in our table that's selected. And that's how the start, next, previous, and recall all work. If we click on next, you'll see that all it's doing is incrementing the selection parameter and then calling that recall selected. If we look at previous, it's incrementing it by -1 and then recalling the selected. And if we look at the recall selected, it's just calling recall selected with whatever row is currently selected. And that's basically how the rundowns work. In a more complex rundown panel, your recall selected might get a little bit more complicated. You might say that if the program is camera 1, then I want to also do something else. Or if the lights are on, then I also want to turn on something else. So you can have it affect multiple things at the same time. And you add those multiple things to the recall method here. And by doing that, you can make some really complex rundowns that control multiple different things with different presets.